greatest companies on the face of the earth was introduced to the world. It had a simple goal, but it achieved much more than that. Can anybody guess what the name of this company is? Apple. No. But this company was named Apple, like you guessed, and I'm going to tell you how Apple got started and what it's doing and some of its products. So how did Apple get started? Apple got started with Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak meeting in a garage saying, we're mechanics, let's build something. And they realized that their true talent was building things, so they decided to make a company. They came up with the name Apple from Steve Jobs because Steve Jobs lived on an apple farm. So Steve Wozniak liked the name, they both agreed, they liked it, they named the company Apple. The company started out with $1,300 to make their first computer type. But how they got this money was interesting because Steve Jobs sold his bus and Steve Wozniak sold his calculator, which those were both very expensive items at the time. But there was actually a third co-founder of Apple, which a lot of people don't know. His name was Ronald Wayne. But 2 months into the company, he sold out his place for $2,300 because he was having family issues. I bet he really regretted that decision later. But, so how did Apple get its famous logo? So, before the Apple we know today, Ronald Wayne, before he left, he drew the first Apple logo. And it actually wasn't an apple at all. It was Sir Isaac Newton sitting under a tree. I'll pass this around after I'm done talking about logos. But so it was just Sir Isaac Newton sitting under a tree with an apple above him. And the same month, that was replaced by a rainbow-colored apple made by graphic designer Rob Janov. And the weird thing is, the reason they put the bite in the apple was because they didn't want anyone to get it confused for a cherry. So that logo lasted from 1976 through 1998. But in 1998, it changed to the black and white logo, which is a black background and a white apple right there. And in 2001, they changed it to an aqua theme, which is the blue apple with the white background. And a couple of years later, Alan Turing came up with the apple that Apple has right now, and it's called the glass theme. And it looks all shiny, looks sort of futuristic, and that's why they liked it, and they kept it, and that's what they're using now. Pass that around. So some of Apple's products were very interesting in the beginning. In 1976, the first item that they made was the Apple I. It wasn't a computer, it was just a board. A board about that big, and it just had all these circuits running through it, and what it did was, it was basically a giant calculator. And they sold 40 to 50 of these, and they only made 40 to 50 of them. So only 40 to 50 Apple ones were made, and that makes them a very rare collector's item. And yeah, only 50 people have them. But the interesting thing is, the first Apple I was sold for $666.66. The weird thing was that was because Steve Wozniak really liked repeating numbers. I thought that was kind of weird. But in 1977, a year later, the Apple II was commercialized, and 2 million computers were made and sold. But that was between 1977 and 1998, so that was like almost 30 years. And they didn't do it alone, obviously. They had saved up enough to buy a warehouse, and that's where Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and 250 other workers worked. So a couple of years later, the Apple II Plus was made. And the only difference was it had a bigger screen, a smaller keyboard, a mouse, which that was the first mouse. It's like super small. And the really cool thing is that this was the first computer ever to have a game on it. The game was sort of like a snake game. It's sort of a mix between Snake and Pac-Man. It was really weird. So in 1999, the Macintosh iOS came out. And that's where the really big hit came. Because iOS stands for Interface Operating System, which is what you see on the screen. Because before that, it was just a black screen with a green terminal behind it, just writing out whatever you did. So the iOS made it a lot more capable of doing whatever you wanted it to do, basically. And they've been upgrading it ever since. That was iOS 1. So Apple, they didn't think inside the box at all. They didn't stick to computers and laptops. They started making handheld devices. Let's take it back a bit and go back to 1993, where the Newton M-Pad was made. And all it could do was send messages through these little weird things that sort of like a big cable on top of the thing. It was like a radio. And in 1994, the next year, the second gen was made of the Newton Pad. And that was basically just a test for the handheld iOS system. And that's how they made the iOS system for just the hands, like the iPod, iPhone. But after 1994, they scratched that and stopped making the Newton pads. And that reason was because they were working on one of their biggest projects ever, which was the iOS 3 for handheld and Macintosh. And that came out in 2007 with the iPhone 1 and iOS 3. And that also came out with the Macintosh Control with the iOS 3. And these two products blew everything out of the water, and everybody was going crazy about buying these things. And so they've just been upgrading the iOS ever since, and that's how Apple got to what it's making today. So that's how Apple came to be, and I hope next time you see an Apple logo somewhere, I hope you remember some of these facts that I told you today. And remember, Apple is